トビデオ
For the past decade, there has been one genre that has swallowed the entire world of anime, manga, and light novels whole. Its name is Isekai. Literally translated to different world or other world, Isekai is a genre that revolves around an ordinary protagonist that is either transported or reborn into a different world where they are given a chance to adapt to their new surroundings and basically start their lives over from scratch. If you have been keeping up with anime for the past couple of years, you are well aware that this genre has taken over. Ever since the runaway success of Sword Art Online, the anime about starting new lives and new worlds had become completely inescapable, to the chagrin of many. The isekai genre got really popular really fast, in no part thanks to the genre's inherent ability to squeeze the otaku dollars from its all-consuming base. The reason why the genre has gotten so much flack, aside from flooding the market, is how much of it is built on catering towards a power fantasy. Cynically written stories with overly long titles, usually involving a blank slate protagonist whose only real characterization is a specialized skill set or cheat ability given to him that allows him to receive gainful employment as the world's resident badass in chief. That is, if he's not too busy beating away the scores of anime girls that are inexplicably attracted to him with a stick.
Etiquette demands that at the very least you should offer to wash Big Brother's back first, and then you can propose marriage to him.
And while authors usually try to dress these stories up with various gimmicks, the fact of the matter is that these stories are generally seen as having little artistic merit, being pulp stories that have no purpose than to just pander to the lowest common denominator of otakudom. With all that said, the isekai genre cannot be completely written off, as there are creators who have taken the genre and its associated tropes and have done some amazing things with them, proving that the genre doesn't have to be seen as just calculated otaku bait. We don't know if the isekai genre has peaked or not at this point in 2021. What we do know is that it's not going away anytime soon. But there is one thing anime fans need to keep in mind when examining the isekai genre. It is not a recent trend. The wave of isekai we are experiencing now is not the first wave. No. In the 90s, there was quite a few isekai titles running around as part of the larger trend of fantasy anime that was taking hold in that decade. However, most of the time, instead of the protagonist being blank slate stand-ins for the otaku NEET crowd, the protagonist was usually teenage girls. Usually ordinary high school students who end up falling into a magical realm by happenstance, and their main goal is almost always finding their way home. But in order to do that, they have to either go on a quest and slay an evil overlord, or get involved in a decades-old conflict. Either way, they will typically end up with a cool sword, a cute prince, or a giant mech with an even cooler sword. Examples include Magic Knight's Rayearth, Visions of Escaflowne, Fushigi Yugi, and 12 Kingdoms. But as popular as this type of story was at the time, it did not originate in the 90s. To really know what the first isekai anime of this type was, we need to go back in time a few years. Yoko Asagiri is an ordinary teenage girl in Japan who is getting ready to confess her love to an unnamed crush. To do this, she has composed, performed, and recorded an entirely original piano sonata and plans to play it to him as a means of confessing her deep-seated love.
この曲はあなたへの思いを込めて私が作ったんです。この曲ができた時、私は決心しました。告白しようって。
Now me personally, I would have gone with the Zapp and Roger mixtape, but different strokes. Yoko heads towards her crush, all while listening to the song in question on her Walkman as a way to work up her courage, but once the big moment comes, she...
でも言えなかった。
But she doesn't dwell on her sudden case of cold feet for long, however. Just when she's about to wallow in her own self-disappointments, Yoko gets transported to a fantastical world beyond her own fantastic dreams. There, she learns that the world she's in is a parallel universe to her world called Ashanti, and that the song she wrote ended up becoming a bridge connecting Ashanti to her own world of Noah. The evil overlord of Ashanti, a prototype Kefka by the name of Zell, desires the Walkman that holds Yoko's song so that he can use it to create a permanent bridge that will allow him to conquer Yoko's world as well. It's up to Yoko to rescue her Walkman and defeat Zell if she ever wants to return to her world, a task that she plans on doing by using the armor and sword handed down by Ashanti's legendary warrior goddess, Leda.
お主一体何者なんじゃ。
何者って普通の女子高校生のはずなんだけど。
女子高校生というのは大したものなんじゃな。
But Yoko's not alone. She is also assisted by Ringham, a very friendly and polite talking dog who can use his long ears to fly.
私は朝霧陽子、普通の女子高校生。
女子高校生なんじゃそれは。
そのはずなんだけど、なんだかよくわからなくなってるの。
どういうことじゃ。
And Yoni, a tiny little shrine maiden of Leda who pilots a giant robot shaped like a tower.
これがレダの戦士か。
Leda, the Fantastic Adventure of Yohko, is an hour-long OVA that is distinctly 80s. One of the many titles released in the OVA format's breakout year of 1985, it was an early success that had staked its claim upon the rich, fertile home video frontier that lay before animation studios that year. Leda was an instant success on VHS, to the point that it got a theatrical release later that year. And when licensing companies were really trying to sell OVAs overseas, Leda was one of their prime titles. Toho, the distributor, even commissioned an English dub for it, albeit in Hong Kong, and it's exactly what you would imagine an 80s dub produced on the fly in Fragrant Harbor would sound like.
I am Yoko Asagiri. I'm a Bobby Soxer.
Over here in the States, Leda is one of those titles that only a handful of retro anime fans can say they've heard of. Its only English release being a sub-only VHS released by Right Stuff in the mid-90s that was only given a limited run. Yep, it's another one of those. But in Japan, it seems like it's more of a cultural touchstone for otaku that's slowly starting to get more recognition. Yoko has been given multiple high-quality PVC figures, and in 2019, Toho released a 4K restoration of the OVA that sold quite well in its first week. And all of that might have something to do with the Isekai craze. Now, Leda isn't actually the first Isekai anime Tomino's Aura Battler Dunbine had it beat by 2 years, but it's the first of a type of Isekai anime, the kind that was popular in the first wave of the genre, the female protagonist-driven kind, the kind that was more about a character's journey over an audience member's fantasy. Leda, the Fantastic Adventure of Yohko, is an important piece of anime history in this regard, but even if it wasn't, it's still a very impressive early OVA, especially when you consider who made it. I've talked about Kaname Productions before in my video on the humanoid, but only briefly, and if you judge them only by their work on that anime, you would probably just write them off as just another basement production house that sprang up to cheaply cash in on a new format.
Hurry up, would you? My coffee's starting to cool off.
But that's a super unfair judgment, because if there was a studio that you could credit for ushering forth the success of the OVA market, it was Kaname Productions. The studio was founded in 1982 by young staffers from Studio Ashi, and while they had mild success with the robot wrestling series Polaris Sanshiro right out of the gate, the studio really had their eye on the brand new concept of direct-to-video anime. Pierrot opened the gate to the new realm of possibilities with their success on Dalos, but it really took a bit before the big companies realized its many advantages. Kaname Productions, being a new upstart studio, was not content to lounge on the sidelines. They immediately capitalized on the home video format and released what many consider to be the second big OVA hit in the wake of Dalos, 1984's Birth. We'll go into more detail about Birth at a later date, but the most important fact about that anime was one of its main animators, who was also Kaname's secret weapon, Mitsumi Inomata. A former animator at Pierrot who had cut her teeth on Urusei Yatsura, Inomata was one of the few female talents in a male-dominated field who was gifted the chance to spread her creative wings. Her ability to keep up with Yoshinori Kaneda's animation style really solidified her as an indispensable creative force at Kaname. This is what got her a job as character designer, animation director, and head animator on Kaname's next big project, Leda, The Fantastic Adventures of Yohko. This was a project conceived by Kaname's other secret weapon, Kunihiko Yuyama. In the early 80s, Yuyama was Studio Ashi's top director, heading up their big hits Goshogun and Magical Princess Minky Momo. Him going to Kaname was a sure sign that the studio was destined to do great projects like Leda, which he both directed and co-wrote. With young yet already proven talent like Yuyama and Inomata being the big creative forces, it was a given that Leda would be a success for Kaname. Unfortunately, it would also be made very apparent that the absence of the two would cause Kaname's ascent to falter. Shortly after Leda was completed in late 1984, Inomata went freelance and Yuyama ended up splitting his directorial duties between Kaname and Studio Ashi. This ended up causing the quality of Kaname's later projects to dip, and they never quite recovered from it. Though Yuyama and Inomata would come back to complete one last project for Kaname, the movie Windaria, it would ultimately end up being the studio's last hurrah. Kaname Productions ultimately shuttered operations in 1988, not even lasting the full decade. It truly was the candle that burned twice as bright and half as long for OVA studios. As for Yuyama and Inomata, they went on to have some fruitful careers. Inomata would go on to create the art and character designs for most of the Tales series of RPGs, while Yuyama would go on to direct the anime adaptations for this little Japanese franchise called Pokemon. Leda, and by extension Kaname Productions, was a very important milestone for these two creators to get where they are today. Along with their ragtag staff, their efforts made Leda the unsung cornerstone that it is. Kaname Productions was, at best, a mid-level studio. They were, after all, a small collective that had broken off of a much bigger studio. Even with their talent and trailblazing attitude, they didn't have Madhouse or Sunrise money. But that's okay. The folks at Kaname knew that and worked within a scale that fit their budget, and that deliberate scaling back really worked in Leda's favor. The world of Ashanti is a world with a lot of open spaces, and the technology that inhabits this world looks to be constructed out of incredibly basic shapes. Now, this is obviously a creative decision made out of necessity. Kaname is not spending unnecessary time and money animating intricately detailed backdrops and giant robots. But this restriction allows for the world of Ashanti to feel like a totally unique fantasy world. By keeping things simple, it actually allows for the team to get really creative in selling the world of Ashanti as something completely different from our world, as seen in the opening credits montage of Yoko exploring the environment. The self-imposed limit in designing the setting also allows for Inomata's gorgeous character designs to shine at their fullest. Inomata is known for her ornate watercolors that evoke a fairy tale atmosphere, lavish, shimmering designs that are nevertheless easy to translate into other mediums. It's like, what if Yoshitaka Amano didn't give the animation team nightmares? Being the animation director on top of being the character designer gives Inomata a significant advantage in rendering her designs to animation form without losing their luster. Having Yoko be completely unchanged from her design sheets to screen is quite impressive, as well as being able to put an ostentatious design like Zell in this anime and keeping his details consistent in each frame. Hint, the key is having him barely move throughout the movie. But the character I would love to see Inomata's thought process behind the most is Ringham. Out of all the animal sidekicks in anime, his design is in my top 10. A magical Scooby-Doo who can glide with his ears and has the incredibly kind voice of Seiyu legend Kei Tomoyama. Simply fantastic.
落とし物じゃよ、お嬢さん。いや、なに、礼には及ばん。親切はわしのもっと受け取りなされ。
What really makes Leda such a gorgeous animated picture, however, is Inomata's animation direction. By simplifying and streamlining wherever it is needed, Inomata and her staff can go all out when the anime calls for it. One way they do this is by not being afraid to go off model. If an action scene flows better with the characters breaking model and distorting into weird shapes, then break model they shall. Shinsaku Kozma, the person who animated most of these kinds of scenes, would go on to really perfect this technique. But the scaling back and model breaking animation is all front-loaded in the first half of the anime, making the second half a constant build-up to bigger, better, and more climactic scenes. Scenes which took elaborate storyboards and elevated them to their full potential. An example being this cut from animator Koji Ito.
愛し合うことだ。
As much as I am praising Inomata and her team, I think Yuyama also deserves some credit for some of the more inspired direction decisions this anime makes. Near the end, there's a scene where Yoko is locked into a seemingly perfect world with her nameless crush as her boyfriend, and it's all done in this stark setting with high contrast colors and shadows to make it obviously fake and staged. And when Yoko begins to resist and push back mentally, we see Zell's creatures in the background going unacknowledged, as if they're waiting for Yoko to fully break the simulation before they launch an attack, a decision that makes a tense scene even more tense. Leda is, bar none, one of the best looking OVAs of its day. From designs, to animation, to direction, it never leaves you cold. I guess if I do have to criticize one technical aspect, it would be that the soundtrack, aside from the very catchy vocal tracks, isn't all that memorable. For an anime where one of the story's main themes is the emotional resonance of music, the background music feels just kinda there. And while we're on the subjects of story and criticism, let's apply the latter to the former, shall we? Probably my biggest criticism that I can level towards Leda is that it really feels like Yuyama and his co-writer Junki Takegami are just making it up on the fly. It's as if the two of them have little bullet points of where Yoko needs to go in the plot, and the time spent weaving the connected bits of story to those points was done under a big one-session story crunch. Okay, so Yoko and Ringam are surrounded by Zell's forces, and Yoko ends up getting eaten by a giant flower, and it turns out the flower is holding the armor and sword of Leda, which causes Yoko to gain the warrior spirit and easily fight off all the bad guys because she immediately knows how to wield the sword now. We got all that? And because of this build the bridge as you walk on it method of storytelling, it also leaves the setting bereft of any real world building. We don't see any villages or people or the name of the strange creatures buzzing around. The only world building that's really allowed is the details that are immediately plot relevant, like the bridge between Ashanti and Noah, and why Leda is such a powerful figure of legend.
ここは昔レダの神殿だったの。レダが伝説の彼方に消え去って、今はこのありさま。
But Leda is an hour-long feature, so I guess they are justified in cutting a lot of the ancillary bits. It's just that without those bits of world building, it kind of makes the world of Ashanti feel a little empty. Where Leda doesn't feel empty is in the characters, specifically Yoko. Yoko strikes the excellent balance for the standard of Isekai protagonist. She is a character that anyone in the audience can relate to and even projects themselves onto, yet she is still her own character with her own personality, goals, and motivations. She's an average ordinary teenager, but with all the emotional insecurity that comes with it.
なんかバカみたいだったわ。一人でいい気になってて、それが嫌で思い切って告白しちゃえって思ったの。でも。
Because of this characterization of Yoko, we can see why Leda is the precursor to most of the first wave of Isekai anime. Aside from having female protagonists and fantasy worlds that are just fantasy worlds and not MMORPG inspired fantasy worlds, the difference between the first wave of Isekai anime and today's modern Isekai anime is one of characterization of the protagonist. In many of today's, for lack of a better term, landfill isekai stories, the male protagonist is characterized by his lack of characterization. He is an empty vessel for the mostly male audience to project themselves effortlessly and allow themselves to fill in the blanks. So instead of seeing a character save the kingdom and get the harem of anime girls, they see themselves doing all that stuff. In contrast, the female isekai protagonist is given way more characterization. Sure, they can still be a vessel for the primary audience to project themselves onto, here being teenaged girls, but not at the expense of character. And there is a reason for this. A common criticism that has been levied at the genre of portal fantasy, the name that was given to the genre before isekai was even a thing, was, why does this story start in one world when so much of it happens in another? It's isekai like Leda that answers this criticism by saddling the protagonist with a problem they are currently having prior to being whisked away to another world. Through their journey to get back home, they may find their answers to such a problem or develop and mature as the story goes on. Either way, by the end of these stories, it is imperative that the protagonist be a much different person coming out of the world than they were going in. Compare this to modern isekai, where the only problem the protagonists face before being transported is that they are a bit of a loser, and the otherworld setting is there to give them better circumstances. They aren't meant to grow as characters. By design, they are to remain static as the world and characters surrounding them changes to suit them. They are there for the story to assure the audience that it's not their fault they're antisocial nerds who spend all their time gaming and can't get a girlfriend. If circumstances were different and you were transported to a world where Fire Emblem trivia was highly sought after knowledge, you'd be living like a king. In the meantime, why not buy another Raftalia figurine you can hot glue to your heart's content? I think that's what I really dig about Leda's story. Its complete lack of cynicism. Sure, this could be attributed to most of the tropes we associate with the isekai genre not having been fully built up yet, but I really do think there's more to Leda than just getting a cute anime girl with 80s hair into Frazetta armor. Yoko's journey to shedding her insecurities and fear of being rejected feels so genuine. Her finding her inner strength is what leads her to ultimately triumph over Zell and return home, where she immediately uses that newfound strength to go confess to her crush.
今なら言える。きっと言える。
Is it a little quaint? Yeah, sure. As I said before, it does feel like they are making this anime up as they went along, and they do really lay it on thick that Yoko is supposed to be who the audience sees themselves as. Her crush doesn't even get a name or a face. But I think Leda really deserves credit in helping lay the groundwork for one of the popular genres in anime, and really showing, in simple terms, how the genre can be elevated to create fantastic stories. And when you combine all the impressive visuals this anime has, it makes the fact that this was done by such a small team so astounding. Leda, the Fantastic Adventure of Yohko, is a hallmark of the early days of the OVA era. An exquisitely animated, simple but sweet story that inadvertently sets the gold standard for all anime that followed it. What else can you call this anime but fantastic?
La, la,